The city was alive with noise, cars honking, people rushing, lights flashing from storefronts. In the middle of it all was Daniel Carter, a wealthy businessman, always in a hurry. He wore a tailored suit, carried a leather briefcase, and checked his expensive watch more times than he spoke to people. To him, time was money, and every second wasted was a lost opportunity. He never paid attention to the world outside his business deals. Homeless people, struggling families, and beggars on the street had become nothing more than part of the background. But on this particular evening, something caught his eye. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, sat on the cold pavement near a shoe store. She had no shoes, just torn socks barely covering her tiny feet. She hugged her knees, shivering in the chilly air. For the first time in a long while, Daniel stopped. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't the type to stop for strangers, especially not homeless people. But something about the little girl made him pause. She wasn't begging. She wasn't even looking at anyone. She just sat there, staring at the shoes displayed in the store window. Her small fingers clutched the edges of her oversized sweater, her feet tucked under her to stay warm. Without thinking too much, Daniel walked into the store. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. A saleswoman greeted him, but he ignored her, scanning the shelves. He picked out a pair of warm winter boots, sturdy and comfortable. He paid quickly and stepped back outside. The girl's eyes widened as he knelt in front of her, holding out the shoebox. "Here," he said, his voice softer than he expected. She hesitated. Her hands shook as she reached for the box. Slowly, she lifted the lid, revealing the brand new shoes inside. Her lips parted, and for the first time, she looked directly at him. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel gave her a small nod, unsure of what else to say. He patted her lightly on the shoulder, then stood up. Without waiting for a response, he walked away, blending back into the busy city. It was just a pair of shoes, nothing more. He didn't think about it again, or at least, he thought he wouldn't. Daniel returned to his usual life. Meetings, phone calls, emails, his world moved fast, and there was no time to dwell on small moments. Days passed. He didn't think about the little girl. Not really. But every now and then, the image of her wide, surprised eyes flashed in his mind. He ignored it. It was just a pair of shoes. One evening, he sat in his office looking over numbers on a screen. His assistant walked in, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. "Busy night?" she asked. "Always," Daniel muttered, without looking up. She hesitated. "You seem distracted." He glanced at her. Was he? He shook his head, brushing the thought away. "Just tired," he said. That night, as he drove home, he passed by the same street where he had seen the girl. He slowed down, his eyes searching the sidewalk. She wasn't there. He didn't know why that bothered him. She was just another stranger. He had done his part. That was enough. Yet as he continued driving, an odd feeling settled in his chest. Something about that moment, about her, felt unfinished. A few days later, Daniel was in his office, going through paperwork when his assistant walked in. She placed a small envelope on his desk. "This came for you," she said. Daniel frowned. He wasn't expecting any personal mail. He picked up the envelope and turned it over. There was no return address. Just his name written in neat, careful handwriting. Curious, he opened it. Inside was a simple, handwritten note. "Come and see." Below the message was an address and a date, just 2 days from now. Daniel read it again, confused. Who would send this? It wasn't a business invite, and it didn't look like some fancy event. His assistant peered at the note. "Are you going?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. That evening, as he sat in his penthouse, he found himself thinking about the letter. He pulled out his phone and searched the address. It was a community center on the other side of town. Not the kind of place he usually visited. His first instinct was to ignore it. He had no reason to go. But then, for the first time in days, he thought about the little girl. Could it be connected? He wasn't sure why, but he made a decision. He was going to find out. 2 days later, Daniel arrived at the address on the invitation. It was a modest-looking community center, nothing fancy. A few people stood outside, chatting, while others walked in through the glass doors. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but this wasn't it. Taking a breath, he stepped inside. The room was filled with people, men, women, and children of all ages. Some looked like volunteers, others like they had come for help. Warm lights hung from the ceiling, and the sound of quiet conversation filled the space. At the front, a small stage stood with a microphone. A young woman stepped up. The room fell silent. Daniel couldn't see her face clearly at first, but then she started speaking. "I want to tell you a story," she said. Her voice was strong, steady. "A story about a stranger who changed my life with a simple act of kindness." Daniel's eyes narrowed. Something about her voice felt familiar. She continued. "I was just a kid, living on the streets, cold, hungry, invisible." His heart pounded. "I didn't ask for help. I didn't expect anything. But one day, someone stopped. He didn't ask my name. He didn't question my past. He simply handed me a box." She smiled softly. "A box with a pair of shoes." Daniel felt his breath catch. It was her, the little girl. Only now she wasn't little anymore. Daniel couldn't move. He stood frozen, his mind racing. The little girl he had given shoes to was now standing on stage, speaking with confidence. She wasn't the fragile child he had seen on the street. She had changed. The young woman continued her story. "That pair of shoes wasn't just something to wear," she said. "It was hope. It was proof that someone saw me, that I wasn't invisible." The audience listened in silence. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had never thought much about that moment. To him, it had been so small, but to her, it had been life-changing. She took a deep breath before continuing. "That day, I went to a shelter. For the first time, I let someone help me. I got food, a warm bed, and a chance to start over. I went to school. I worked hard, and now I run this community center, so no child has to feel the way I did." Applause filled the room. Daniel remained still, his hands clenched at his sides. Then the woman looked out into the crowd. She paused, her eyes scanning the faces. Then she saw him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her expression softened, and a knowing smile spread across her face. She nodded slightly, as if to say, "I remember you." Daniel's heart pounded. He had come here without knowing why. But now everything made sense. The simple act of buying a child's shoes had changed her life, and now she was changing others. The applause faded, and the room buzzed with quiet conversations. But Daniel didn't move. His mind was spinning. She remembered him. Slowly, the young woman stepped down from the stage, making her way through the crowd. People greeted her with smiles, but her eyes stayed locked on Daniel. Then she stood in front of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled. "I was hoping you'd come." Daniel swallowed. "You sent the invitation?" She nodded. "I had to. I wanted to thank you properly." He shifted uncomfortably. "It was just a pair of shoes." She shook her head. "To you, maybe. But to me, it was the moment I realized I mattered." Daniel wasn't sure what to say. He had spent his life making big deals, handling millions of dollars, yet this small act, something he barely remembered, had changed someone's world. "I never expected this," he admitted. She chuckled softly. "Neither did I. But that's the thing about kindness, you never know how far it will go." He let her words sink in. Then, for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something shift inside him. A warmth he didn't recognize. He cleared his throat. "So, what happens now?" She gestured around the room. "Now, I keep helping. And you," she paused, studying him, "you could help too if you wanted." Daniel hesitated. He had always given to charity, but from a distance. Writing checks, making donations, never getting involved. But this was different. This was real. He looked around at the people, at the faces filled with hope. Then he looked back at her. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to do more. Daniel stayed at the event longer than he planned. He watched as people came up to the young woman, thanking her, asking for advice, sharing their stories. This wasn't just a charity event, it was a community, a place where people found hope. He had spent his whole life surrounded by wealth, but he had never seen anything like this. The young woman turned to him again. "Would you like to see what we do here?" Daniel hesitated. He had never been the type to get personally involved, but something about this place, about her, made him curious. "Sure," he said. She led him through the building, showing him the different rooms. A small library filled with donated books, a kitchen where volunteers prepared meals, a classroom where children sat, learning from patient teachers. "This center helps hundreds of people," she explained. "Kids, families, people trying to get back on their feet." Daniel nodded slowly. He had funded organizations before, but this was different. He could see the impact. He could feel it. As they walked back to the main hall, she stopped and turned to him. "You've already helped more than you know," she said. But if you want to do more, there are plenty of ways. Daniel glanced around, taking in everything. He had spent his life chasing success, believing money was the only thing that mattered. But standing here, he realized something else. Maybe real success wasn't just about wealth. Maybe it was about what you left behind. He took a deep breath. "Tell me how I can help." A warm smile spread across her face. "I thought you'd say that." That night, as Daniel walked out of the community center, he felt different. Lighter. As if, for the first time, he had done something that truly mattered. And all it had taken was a pair of shoes.